Good morning, everybody. We will get started in just a few minutes to let everybody trickle in here. As we wait to get started, go ahead and pop your name in the chat and introduce yourself if you're interested. Oh, I just got a message that the chat is disabled, so we will work on that. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining today. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions. And today I'm going to be presenting on mastering your qualitative methodology. Before we get into the content, I do just want to let you all know a little bit about Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation editing and consulting company. So we help students that are working on their dissertations from the very beginning of the process, like topic development, developing your research questions, all the way through each of the chapters and the final defense. We have a number of different services. So if you're interested, or if you're someone who's looking to get some one-on-one help with your dissertation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We do have a free consultation where students can kind of check in, talk to us about your research, and see if there's any areas that we can help with. We also have a number of free resources on our website, and the links will be in the chat shortly in case you're interested in looking at those as well. So as far as the qualitative methodology chapter goes, today I'll be going over this chapter. We'll specifically be talking about qualitative methods. If you're someone who is wanting to do a study that is more quantitative in nature or mixed methods, we also have webinars that are dedicated to those specific types of projects. They are also on our website, and we have them regularly throughout the year. As far as this qualitative chapter goes, these are the components that you would typically see in the qualitative methodology chapter. So the introduction, the research design and the rationale, role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and then a summary. We always recommend to students that when you start writing, or when you're about to start writing, reach out to your school, reach out to your chair, and ask for a template or a checklist to ensure that you know what components are meant to be in that chapter. This list that I have here on this slide is a pretty standard list for what you would expect, but every school is a little bit different. So before you start, make sure to check in with your school so that you know exactly what's required of you as you go in to outline, draft, and finalize this chapter. Today, I'll go in to each of these components, and then at the end, we will open it up for question and answer. Your chat should be working now, so if you do have questions, you can drop them in the chat as well. So like most chapters, the methods is going to begin with an introduction. Here in this introduction, you will want to reorient the reader to your study, and then provide a preview for what they should be expecting coming up in this chapter. So to do this, you will want to restate the purpose of your study, and that should be done verbatim. So you should be maintaining consistency in the language that you use for your purpose statement and your research questions throughout the entire dissertation. This is just going to make sure that there is no confusion or ambiguity in what exactly your study is for and what exactly you're wanting to research. So you can copy and paste the purpose statement and the research question down anywhere where you are bringing it up again in your paper. So you'll want to restate that, really make sure that going into this methods chapter, it's clear why you're conducting this study and what exactly you intend on studying. And then you can preview the sections that are going to be coming up in the chapter. So using those subheadings that are going to organize your chapter, you can say something like, in this chapter, the researcher will provide a detailed description of the XYZ, really whatever those subheadings are that you're going to be talking about. Next, you are going to talk about your research design, and sometimes you'll also talk about your research method here. So for the purposes of this webinar, your research method is qualitative, and you may here want to explain why you've selected a qualitative research method. Now, your method and your design, the selection of them should all be rooted in the purpose statement and the research questions for your study. So when you are developing your study, you should begin with what it is you want to study, and then from there, move into deciding what the most appropriate method is. So if you are looking to study something related to perceptions, thoughts, feelings, in those cases, a qualitative method is going to be most appropriate. If you are looking to study maybe associations between two variables, or if you're trying to quantify or measure specific variables, then a quantitative approach is going to make more sense. So here you'll just want to clearly explain the qualitative methodology and why it is that you're using the qualitative methodology. Then you will do the same thing for the research design. So within the qualitative methodology, what research design are you selecting to answer your research questions? There are a number of different designs that you can select, from phenomenology to case studies to grounded theory, and each of them has a different purpose. So again, this selection of the design should be rooted in what your study is about. So for example, if you are wanting to generate a theory through this study, then a grounded theory approach would be well suited for that type of study. If your purpose statement is related to understanding the lived experiences of a particular sample, then phenomenology would be more appropriate. So to identify what study is best for you, we do have some blog posts on our website. We also have a webinar that is dedicated to those different types of studies, but really just review the different qualitative research designs and try to see what their utility is and try to match that up, kind of working backwards to see what makes most sense for your study. In this section, you will want to identify and describe the design that you've selected. So if you select case study, you'll want to identify it and then talk about what it is used for. And in that, you should be really showing that congruence with your particular study. So why is this type of design best aligned to do the research that you are doing? One way that you can do that is by explaining some of the key features of that research design that align with your study. So for example, I mentioned lived experiences. If you are looking at lived experiences, then a phenomenological study may make the most sense. So you want to call out some of those hallmark pieces of the design that make sense for your study. And then you also might want to talk about some alternative research designs that you considered as you were developing your study, but you didn't go with. So you might say, grounded theory was considered for this study, and then explain why grounded theory was not aligned with your study's purpose and research questions. So in doing this, you're showing the reader that you have kind of this wide array of knowledge around qualitative designs, and you've really thought critically to justify the selection of your design. So if you're thinking, well, I'm not really sure, what type of research I want to do, maybe you already have your purpose statement or your research questions, and now you're kind of thinking through these development steps of, what type of research method should I use? What type of design should I use? Here are some reasons why a qualitative design would make sense for your study. So qualitative data is textual data. So think interviews, focus groups, documents, observations, whereas quantitative data is going to be numerical data. So maybe survey instruments, maybe body measurements, anything that generates numbers. If you are planning to collect some of these interviews, focus groups, these things where people are really talking to you and giving you more of an in-depth explanation to their thinking or their feelings, then a qualitative design is most likely appropriate for what you're trying to study. With qualitative research, the sample size is generally a bit smaller than quantitative research. And the reason for that is twofold. One, with these interviews and focus groups, typically you aren't going to be able to generate an extremely large sample size for the interviews and focus groups. The sample size for qualitative research is really rooted in data saturation. So various research designs in qualitative research have shown that anywhere from about maybe 9 to 12 interviews is going to start to generate the same type of information. So at some point, your participants are saying very similar things, and there aren't new themes or codes emerging from the data. So for that reason, the sample size is smaller for qualitative studies, and the goal of this type of study is not really to generalize the findings to the entire population. So if you were to conduct a qualitative study of teachers at your local school, you wouldn't necessarily say that the experiences of those teachers are generalizable to all teachers in the US or all teachers in your state. You're really just kind of chipping away at this particular phenomenon experienced by that sample. One other point of difference between qualitative and quantitative research is the hypothesis testing. So in qualitative research, you are not going to be testing a hypothesis. Instead, you're going to be answering research questions. And here we're not quantifying the results. So you won't be, reporting frequencies or descriptive statistics about the responses that people gave, because the data, again, is textual. You may notice in your work that there are, maybe a majority of participants responding one way, or maybe one participant is an outlier that doesn't have a similar experience. But again, the objective here is not to say 50% of participants endorsed this particular feeling or perception. It's really to just see what bubbles up from the data and report that, but not in a way that is adding weight or numerical value to that data. So here are a few of the qualitative research designs that we see students using most often: case study, phenomenology, generic, qualitative, grounded theory, and ethnography. I will go through each of these here, and hopefully this helps you start thinking about what design is most appropriate for your particular study. So case studies, these are specifically used for getting a really in-depth analysis over time of a specific example. Case studies can be both, you can have a single case study or you can have a multiple case study. And the definition of a case is really dictated by the researcher. So one example I'll give, there was a paper done, it was a case study of hurricane experiences. And for this particular paper, the hurricane that they were studying was Hurricane Andrew. And the cases were each of the people that they spoke with who had experienced that study. That's one way to go about it. Another way to go about this type of study is to, if you're looking at describing hurricane experiences, you could describe multiple hurricane experiences and have each hurricane be a case. So the way that you define the case is really up to you. But the important feature here is that the cases are all bound by a uniting factor. So in the case of the first example I gave, the uniting factor is having experienced Hurricane Andrew. Each of the cases had experienced Hurricane Andrew. Whereas in the second example, each of the cases had experienced a hurricane. So it's really up to you to decide how far you want to pull back that magnifying glass in terms of defining your case. Case studies, since they're really trying to drill down and look at whatever the phenomenon or the thing is that you are studying from multiple angles, typically these are done by collecting multiple different sources of data. So you may do interviews, you may also look at a document review or pictures, kind of just piecing together each of these different pieces of qualitative data to understand that case from different perspectives. So that is kind of the big trademark piece of this. You have multiple data collection methods. And then the purpose here, so what you will get out of a case study is a really rich description of that case from each of those different vantage points. And in terms of reporting, you will be examining the themes that are emerging from each of those data sources. So this differs quite a bit from phenomenology. Phenomenology is specifically used for exploring the lived experiences of participants and really describing how those participants make meaning of their experiences. So in this case, the main method of data collection is in-depth interviews. So you may collect or conduct 60-minute interviews or 90-minute interviews with participants to really understand their experiences. So in case studies, we talked about the experience of being in a hurricane. In phenomenology, one sample paper that I'll mention is exploring the lived experiences of homeless women in California. That was a paper that I worked on where we were wanting to understand, how do these women describe their experience being homeless? How do they describe their transition to homelessness? So again, in this case, we want to see what are the shared experiences in this sample. Are there similarities in their transition to homelessness or in the way that they live or behave to kind of deal with their surroundings? So in this case, you're really looking at those common and shared experiences. And from that, you're trying to find the essence of the experience. So what are those pieces that seem to be really prominent across all of the participants in the sample? Is there anything that they're reporting commonly that you think speaks to that particular experience that you are looking into studying? I'm going to do generic qualitative last, so let's go on to grounded theory. Grounded theory, this is specifically used when you are wanting to study something, but maybe there is no theory that's already developed for that particular phenomenon. So for example, you may have heard of the stages of grief. The stages of grief is something that came about through a grounded theory study. So the researchers wanted to understand, how do people go through that grieving process? They conducted a qualitative study, interviewing participants, and through that, they generated this theory for that process. So this type of study would be appropriate to use if there is not already an existing theory for what you're looking at studying, or if there is a theory, the data that was collected and analyzed to develop that theory was not reflective of the population that you want to study. So, for example, using this idea of the stages of grief, maybe you want to study the stages of grief, but from a specific population, like widows or, I don't know, maybe victims of something specific. So you want to look at that specific group of people, and you feel that the existing conceptual model around the stages of grief was not representative of the group that you're interested in studying. In that case, that may be some good rationale for why you need to then go on and conduct this study. This is a little bit more intensive in terms of kind of the methods that are involved. The coding is a little bit more intensive. So the way that you analyze the data in grounded theory is very specific and a little bit more in depth than the studies that I've already talked about. The way that you would collect data for this type of study is through field work, interviews. You can look at documents, take notes, so memoing as you're going through each of these data collection methods. And in this case, you have a very iterative process of collecting data and analyzing data. So earlier I talked about data saturation. Data saturation is when there are no new themes emerging from the data. In grounded theory, rather than collecting the data, then moving on to analyzing it and then writing, you are kind of going in a cycle of collecting data, analyzing that data, and then you're going to collect more data to kind of enrich this analysis, and then analyze that new data and see what it's adding. So you're kind of going through this back and forth process, this kind of cycle of collecting and analyzing until you have a really strong theory and model around whatever it is that you're studying. So for that reason, this is a little bit more time intensive. And for students enrolled in dissertation credits or in PhD programs, because it's more time intensive, it can also be kind of more resource intensive. So you may be spending more semesters on this type of study than you would with a different type of design. But the focus here is to really just generate the theory. So in this type of study, you will want to have some sort of conceptual model that is explaining the theory that you have found from the data. Ethnography, this is another one that is a little bit more intensive than the first 2 or 3 that I've discussed. So with ethnography, you are specifically looking at a cultural group. So I think typically when you think cultural group, you're thinking of race or ethnicity, which can be what you're looking at here. So maybe you're wanting to look at a specific phenomenon from a specific ethnic group. And so to do that, you are going to be really immersing yourself in the environment that that group is in. But this can also be about societal groups. So for example, there's some work on ethnography in individuals who use substances. So you can also study these different subcultures, or you can study ethnic or minority groups, but you're not limited to just ethnicity. You can really get into some of these subculture groups as well, and really come up with some very interesting findings based on those particular groups as well. So here you're wanting to generate this holistic inquiry of the group, the social network, or the institution that you're studying. So if you in your mind are thinking of a particular group, then that might be a good a good sign that this type of study works well for you. An area where I think this gets a little bit confused is if you are looking at a particular profession. So if you're looking at a profession like teaching or nurses or something like that, just think about what it is that you want to understand from that profession, to differentiate between whether ethnography makes most sense for you or a different type of design. This is really if you want to understand the phenomenon within that particular like context of that profession. So just kind of think through that a little bit here. In terms of data collection, this will also be a major deciding factor for whether or not you use ethnography. Here you need to be very immersed in this group. So that will come from extended field work with the participants, observing the participants, conducting interviews and conversations with them. So the data collection is also like a pretty intense piece here where you want to be completely surrounded by this group. And this is going to give you the validity of not only collecting the data, but yourself, you are acting as not a participant, but someone who is also like within this group for an extended period of time. So you have that firsthand account of yourself being around, and then the secondhand account of the data that you're collecting. Okay. And then if none of the designs that I've described are a clear fit for what you have in mind, or if multiple are a clear fit, so if there's multiple designs here that seem to make sense for what you're wanting to do, then a generic qualitative design may be most appropriate for you. So a generic qualitative design is really good when your research questions don't fit perfectly within any of the designs that I've already described. This is where you're kind of able to modify your data collection to fit a little bit better of what your needs are. So you can be doing interviews, questionnaires, written or oral surveys, or looking at some of those documents. So here it's kind of just a more Here is just, sorry, I was reading the chat. Here is just a more kind of flexible design where you don't have these very specific prescriptive requirements like the others. I also included a citation on this slide, this Percy et al. 2015 paper. I find that sometimes students have a difficult time rationalizing the use of generic qualitative. So if you're in that position, this paper may help you understand why this design does stand on its own. It's not a cop-out. It has its own place within this type of research. So once you have justified your selection and explained how it aligns with your study, you are going to go into the role of the researcher. So here you're going to be talking about how you are going to be interacting with your study. So are you going to be an observer? Are you going to be a participant? Will you have a hybrid role? Again, that's going to be rooted in the type of study you're doing. So if you're doing ethnography, then you may have more of a hybrid role because you will be immersed with the group that you are studying. Next, you'll want to talk about any potential conflicts of interest or power dynamics that exist between you and the participants. So remember here that the methods are going to provide a foundation for the research for the readers to understand your results. So here's where they need to be aware of your positionality and your reflexivity with regards to the topic that you're studying. So if there's any personal qualities that relate to your research. So for example, if you are studying a particular ethnic group and you are also part of that ethnic group, you may bring a different perspective to this topic than other researchers. So all of that is really important to include here. You know, how do you fit within this research? This information is going to help the reader understand what your unique perspective is and how that may impact the results and your understanding. Remember here that qualitative research has kind of this wide array of interpretation. So the way that you interpret and code data is going to be different from every person, no matter the context, right? I might read something and think it's completely different from you, and vice versa. So providing this explanation of really who you are, what your background is, and how you interact with this data is going to help the reader get an idea going into the results of where you're coming from. Specifically, if you are conducting research at your place of business, so maybe you're a teacher and you're going to be surveying other teachers at your school, or if you're a supervisor and you're going to be collecting data from employees, it's really important to include that information as well. And to kind of be very transparent about those dynamics, because again, that's going to help the readers understand your results and understand what the relationship between you and the participant is. Next, you'll want to talk about any areas of bias and how you might mitigate these. So a lot of that can come from the different dynamic that you have with the participants, if you have one. So for example, if you are interviewing your coworkers, you may want to mitigate the bias or any potential like reporting bias on the part of the participant by making sure that there's very clear informed consent procedures and that the participant knows that their statements and the information that they share is going to be confidential and that they will remain anonymous throughout your reporting of this study. So just thinking through how you're going to ensure that there's no bias on the part of the participants in terms of what they report, and also on your part in terms of how you are reporting the results in your paper. And then thinking about any ethical issues. So again, as you go through this process of describing these conflicts, it's going to bring up things for you of how you might deal with any challenges that come up as a result of special circumstances like working where you're collecting data or collecting data from people you know. So just kind of have a plan in place and think critically here about how can I ensure that my participants feel that they can share openly with me, they feel that their information is protected, and then also how am I going about my data collection in an ethical way and my data management in an ethical way to ensure that I'm doing my part to also protect my participants. Next, you will really get into the nitty-gritty of your methods. So far up to this point, you have described what type of study you're doing, but this section here is really the meat of the study. Remember here that the methods should be written in a way that is so clear that somebody else can reproduce the research. So I always recommend that when you're getting started on this chapter, start with a bulleted list from applying for IRB approval all the way through to when your data is ready to be analyzed. Start with a bulleted list of each step and intermediate step that is needed to collect the data and prepare it for analysis. So that is going to help you just write a very clear methods in a logical way that's, making sense and is in order. So you'll begin with your population and your sample. The population is the group of people that you will be drawing your sample from. So for example, if you are conducting a study where you want to understand the perceptions of teachers regarding remote learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, the population for your study is teachers, but the sample for your study is going to be the individuals who actually participate in the study. So you will want to make sure to draw that distinction. You may want to provide some demographic information for the population, so the overarching population. You may say something like there are X amount of teachers in the United States, and then provide some demographic characteristics for that population. And then you'll transition into saying, for this study, I intend, if you're in the proposal phase, or for this study, I collected data from, if you're in the final defense stage, X amount of teachers. So you're explaining what the larger population is, and then funneling down to how many participants from that population are included in your sample. In doing this, you will want to talk about your sampling strategy. So typically with qualitative studies, a purposive sample will be used. What that means is that the individuals that you are going to be included in your sample are selected based on pre-established criteria. So for example, with that study about teachers, your purposive sample would have to be people who are teachers. That's just kind of, ensuring that the people that you are collecting data from are people who can really speak to the topic at hand. So that's a pretty common sampling strategy for qualitative research, is this purposive sampling. Next, you'll want to talk about inclusion and exclusion criteria. So are there any characteristics outside of the purposive sample that are absolutely necessary to participate in your study? Typically, depending on your study, of course, but typically the characteristics will include being over 18, being willing to provide informed consent, but there may be some other characteristics that are important for your study. So if you are looking at a particular profession, you may want your participants to have a certain number of years of experience in that profession. So that could be something that you include in your inclusion criteria. It really just depends on your study in terms of what that inclusion criteria is going to be. Personally, once I did a study of women on maternity leave, and for that particular study, they needed to be employed at the time that they became pregnant. So kind of just thinking through, who do you want to hear from, and baking that into your inclusion and exclusion criteria is going to be important for making sure that your sample is really the right people to collect this data from. You'll also want to talk about how you're going to verify this inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it could be that you are doing a phone screen. So maybe once participants become engaged with you, you ask them a few questions over the phone, like, are you over the age of 18? How many years of experience do you have in this profession? And using that to select yes or no, whether or not they're going to be included in your study. Another way that you can verify inclusion and exclusion criteria is through a survey. So I highly recommend, no matter what type of study you're doing, what type of design you're doing, you collect demographic information from your participants to characterize your sample later. In that demographic survey, you may start it off with a few of these screening questions, and that's going to help you rule participants out if they don't meet the eligibility criteria for your study. You'll also want to talk about that sample size. So your sample size is something that, again, is going to be driven by data saturation, but you can anticipate the sample that you should include in the study by reviewing the literature related to your research design. So each research design has some foundational work that talks about the typical sample size for that study that is needed to reach data saturation. So you may find a range like 9 to 12 interviews is typically a sweet spot to collect any emerging themes. So here you'll just want to provide a number for how many participants or cases you intend to collect data from, and include citations to show that you have some theoretical basis for this particular sample size. And then this part is really important as well. So explain, and this is where your bulleted list is going to come in, explaining exactly what the steps are to identify the participants, to contact them, and to actually recruit them into the study. So again, all of those nitty-gritty steps, a common process that I see for recruitment, or an example you might use is maybe you're going to post a flyer or email out a flyer to a group of people, and then include your contact information on that flyer and have them contact you back. That's a really simple recruitment strategy. And that's, a great method to use, but you also want to include information on how you know who to email. So do you need to reach out to a particular site? Do you need to request access to contact information? So just thinking through, the operational steps for how you're going to do this, you'll want to describe that here as well. And then once participants do reach out to you, what are the next steps there? So it could be at that point, you're conducting that phone screen where you're asking them those eligibility questions, or maybe you are sending them a survey with eligibility questions. Whatever it is, just make sure that you are really clearly and in order describing these steps. Next, you are going to talk about your instrumentation. So with the qualitative study, your instrumentation is probably going to be some type of interview or focus group protocol. So here you'll want to talk about the interview or focus group and explain here how you've developed this instrument. So for example, if you have 3 research questions, it may be helpful in this section to explain how your research questions are connecting to your interview guide or your focus group protocol. So really, what questions in this instrument are going to answer the specific research questions that your entire study is trying to answer. This is an important step not only in the writing process, but also in your study development, because without really going through the exercise of connecting your purpose statement and your research questions to your data collection instrument, you're going to lose some of the consistency when you're going to analyze your data later. So for example, if your research questions are, and this is an example from a study that I'm working on, where I'm kind of coming into the project and this step was a little bit missed. So the research questions are, how long does it take patients to identify symptoms? But our instrument does not have questions related to time. So we're running into this challenge where we want to answer this research questions, but because our instrument does not have that time factor, we just don't have the data to answer that research question. So here you really just want to think through, go through the exercise of mapping your interview guide onto your research questions. I recommend making a table and just showing exactly which research questions are being answered by the questions in your interview guide. This is going to help you develop a concise interview guide. And again, it's going to make sure that you are collecting the data you need to answer your questions. If you're using a theoretical model for your study, the interview guide or the focus group guide should also clearly have some features of that theoretical model. So you want to make sure you're having this methodological congruence where if you're starting with a theory, you are working with that theory all the way through your methods and your results as well. So that's something to think through as well. If you have that model, maybe you have a few questions that are related to each piece of the model that your study is based in. If you are going to be doing a document review in your qualitative study, you'll just want to explain here in this instrumentation section how you know that the documents you're reviewing are verified sources. So for example, maybe you're going to be reviewing course syllabi. So you may say this syllabi is publicly available on the university website, or this policy is publicly available in XYZ location. So just describing the origins of the document so that we know that it is indeed a reliable source for your study. And then this last bullet here, it's kind of going along with what I've been saying. The point here is to ensure that the data sources you're using are going to be the right data sources to answer that research question. And again, writing aside, this is a really important exercise just for yourself to make sure that when you get to the analysis stage, there's no gaps and you're really able to answer the questions that you've posed. So next you will talk about the actual data collection procedures. So here you want to talk about the instrument that you're going to be using and all of the features around that data collection. So where are you collecting data? Are you going to be doing it in person? Are you going to be doing it over Zoom? If you're doing it in person, where are you doing it? So again, if you're collecting data at your place of business, are you going to be interviewing your coworkers at work? If you are, what are the implications of that? So kind of thinking through some of these pieces as well. Who's going to be collecting the data? Are you going to be conducting the interviews yourself? Do you have a research team or a research assistant that's going to be helping you with this? That's going to be important to include here as well. Next, you'll want to talk about the frequency of the data collection events. So depending on the type of study you're doing, you may be having multiple interactions with participants. For example, if you're doing ethnography or grounded theory, or maybe even phenomenology, you may be interviewing participants over a period of time. So if you are, you'll want to describe and provide maybe a brief schedule for that data collection process and some rationale as to why you are selecting the specific time points that you are. The duration of the data collection is going to be important as well. Typically, I see students developing an interview guide that is intended to last about 60 minutes. When you're thinking about the duration, also think about your analysis later on. How many pages of transcripts are you going to get? It's going to be important to know this going into your data analysis. How much do you expect to get out of these interviews? So one way that you might anticipate this is by piloting your instrument. So maybe you do 1 or 2 interviews with a colleague or a peer, just as kind of practice interviews to see what the length of that instrument is. This will also help you with kind of practicing some of those facilitator skills and making sure it's smooth, and also clarifying any areas of the interview guide that may be unclear to the participant. Then you'll want to talk about how the data is recorded. Since you are collecting textual data, you will typically, and I highly recommend, audio or video recording your data collection and having it transcribed or transcribing it yourself. That's going to be really helpful. I know sometimes people will just take notes as they are listening to participants talk, but having the audio recording can just be helpful to look back on because it can be difficult to collect everything just by taking notes, especially when you're trying to give the participant your full attention. You may miss things. So I recommend, if possible, audio recording. Zoom is a great option, or you could use your phone. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you're having the data transcribed. So I see students using Zoom transcripts. So Zoom has a feature where you can develop a transcript as you record, or sending out their work to be transcribed. So sending out their recordings to companies and having them do that for you. Whatever you do, you just want to make sure that you have a built-in process for cleaning the transcripts. So making sure that the transcript is reflective of the recording. I know when I use Zoom recordings, sometimes the recorder is very sensitive. So if I breathe or if I say it'll break up the lines of text, or I might find typos and things like that. So just have a process for cleaning the data before you begin to analyze it. That way you're not having to go back to the recording multiple times during the analysis process. Just kind of build that step in early so that you can streamline the next steps after. And then you'll want to have some contingency plans in place. So In the previous section, you talked about a particular sample size that you're going to use for this study. But as we know, things come up, life happens. You may have participants who agree to participate, and then something happens where they're not able to attend, or they decide to drop out of the study. So just have a plan in place, and it could be as simple as just continuing your already established recruitment procedures for any instances where you're still needing to collect data to meet the sample size that you need for your study. Some researchers will choose to do debriefing procedures. So you might provide participants with the transcript or with the results of your study. And you may ask them, do you think that this is reflective of our conversation? Or you just may want them to verify that they agree. That is a validation strategy. So it adds a validity to the work that you're doing, and that you are confirming with participants that you are truly representing their thoughts or perceptions. So that may be something that you do for your study. There's a number of validation strategies that you can use. So it's not a 100% thing that you have to do, but if you choose to do it, you will just want to also describe that process. So how are you getting back in touch with the participant? If you're not able to get in touch with the participant, or what alternate validation strategy are you using? So just thinking through some of those processes. Next, you will talk about analysis. So for analyzing your data, there are a number of different ways that you can do this. You can use an inductive process, or you can use a deductive process. So if you're using an inductive process, that means that you're going to be developing codes from the data. So for example, I might have a transcript. Maybe this slide is my transcript, and I'm looking through this, and I want to see what statements here fit into categories, or what statements would I categorize. So if I'm looking at this slide, I might say software, and I might highlight the word software, and I'll code that as technology. I might put that under a technology code. So in this case, I'm reading, and based on what I'm reading, I'm developing codes. That would be your inductive approach. If you want to go with a deductive approach, maybe you have a theoretical model and your codes are going to be based on that model. So for example, if your model has 3 components, biological, emotional, physical, you may have 3 codes for biological, emotional, and physical. And in this case, rather than having the codes bubble up from the data, you have these predetermined codes that you are going to be applying to the data. So that's a process that you might go with as well. Thematic analysis is a very common approach used for analyzing this data. That is a 6-step process of kind of really reviewing your transcript, looking for codes, and moving from codes to themes. So overall, here you just want to describe how it is that you are making sense of this data and how you're going to develop themes from it. We have a few webinars that are dedicated to this topic of actually how to analyze it. So I recommend that you check those out. We also have some blog posts that can help with this too, specifically related to the tool that you're using to analyze the data. So you can print out all your transcripts, get some colorful highlighters, and do a by hand analysis, or you can use a qualitative software. So some softwares that I like to use when I analyze are Deduce, InVivo, Atlas TI. And what these softwares do is they allow you to upload all of your transcripts. You can code the transcripts, and then you can look across all of the transcripts together to see what the distribution of the codes you're applying is, kind of what codes are more prevalent, and it's just giving you a really organized view of the data. So I highly recommend them if that's something that's available to you. I know Deduce has a free 30-day trial. So if you maybe don't have a software, but you want to use one, you can kind of do a sprint of analysis and within those 30 days, and that tool may be helpful for you. And then lastly, I want to talk about your trustworthiness of your research. So specifically talking about credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. These are the tenets that we're wanting to establish in the research to make sure that your findings are accurate, they represent the participants that you have sampled, and that there is an element of your research that is reproducible. So this would be the last section here where you're talking about this. So you may talk about your informed consent procedure. You may talk about any peer debriefing or member checking that you built into your study. These are some helpful things as well that are going to really add that validity to the study that you're doing. But I know we are close to time, so I will pause here for questions. If you have questions, you can just put them in the chat. Okay, I see we have a question about narrative inquiry. So narrative inquiry is another qualitative research design that you can absolutely use. It's not included in this presentation just for time's sake. But some types of data that you might collect for narrative inquiry could be stories from participants, autobiographical information, maybe letters, conversations. You can also conduct interviews, family stories. And the purpose of that is really to create meaning of the narrative of a particular person or a group of people's lives. So it's definitely another great source. Just depends on what exactly the purpose of your research is. So if the purpose of your research questions is to tell a story, then a narrative approach may be good for you. This is a good question, John. So John wants to know, in the coding phase, is it appropriate to have a third-party assistance from a firm like Statistics Solutions? So earlier I talked a little bit about validation strategies. One validation strategy is to have an external auditor. So that could be someone who is reviewing your methods or your analysis. So it is a built-in strategy that you can use to really show consistency in your coding. So yeah, I think it's definitely appropriate. Here at Statistics Solutions, we do help students analyze their data, develop their methods chapter, and also report their results. And it's really up to students how they choose to report our assistance. So absolutely, that's something you can do. And we have a number of services related to helping students with that. I see that someone is wanting some articles related to narrative. Yes, let me pull a few and I'll put them in the chat. No problem, John. And again, we do offer a complimentary 30-minute consultation. So if you are, someone who's never used a consultant before and you're like, I'm not really sure how this works, that call is a great opportunity to hear about the services and also talk about any help that you might need with your study. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, if you don't have any questions, thank you all so much for joining today. I hope we see you in the future webinars. I'm going to stay on to pull some, oh, and happy Thanksgiving to you too, Melinda. I'm going to stay on to pull some resources for narrative inquiry, so I will be here. But if not, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a good holiday.